Welcome to the Beverage Business Hub Podcast, where we talk digital marketing for your small to medium-sized beverage brand. If you're looking to grow your wine, spirits, or drinks business in a digital world, then you're in the right place. Sit back, pour a glass, and soak up a world of knowledge from experts in this space to get better results with fewer resources and in half the time. Before we dive into this episode, subscribe to the podcast so you never miss a beat and you can stay ahead in a crowded marketplace. So without further ado, let's dive right in. I want to ask you something, and I want you to sit with it honestly before you answer. How much have you spent in time, in money, in attention on your cellar door experience? The physical space, the tasting setup, the staff training, the way the light comes through in the afternoon, the way the wines are presented, in what order, with what story, the way a visitor feels when they walk in versus when they walk out. For most wineries, the cellar door is the star. It's the place where everything you believe about your wine and your brand becomes real. It's where people taste not just the product, but the philosophy. It's where they meet the people behind the label, where a feeling gets created that no advertisement could ever replicate. And then they leave. And for most wineries, if we're being completely honest, almost nothing happens next. Not because the winery doesn't care, not because they didn't have a good visit, but simply because the systems, the thinking, and the investment that went into the physical experience simply wasn't extended into what comes after it. And that, my friends, is the cellar door trap. You've built something extraordinary, and then you let people walk away from it with almost no thread connecting them back. This episode is about why that happens and what it costs, and more importantly, what it reveals about how most wineries think about the relationship between the physical experience and the business they're trying to build. Let me tell you who walks through your cellar door, and this is something you already know. However, it might need to be reminded of that this is not a cold lead. This is not someone who just randomly clicked on an ad or someone who's followed you on Instagram and passively scrolled your content. They may have previously, but as soon as they make that deliberate decision to get into the car, drive to your winery, and give you their time and pay for the experience of meeting you, think about what that represents. They already knew you existed. They decided you were worth the effort. They chose you out of however many other things that they could have done with their afternoon, because something about what you make or who you are felt worth pursuing. And then they showed up in person and said, with their presence, "I'm interested." These are among the highest intent, highest potential customers that your business will ever encounter. If you were to rank every person in your database by how likely they are to become a loyal long-term wine club member, the person who visited your cellar door last Saturday would be near the top of that list every single time. And yet most wineries treat them after they leave almost exactly the same as everybody else. They go on an email list, they get the newsletter, maybe there's an automated follow-up, a thank you for visiting email that arrives at some point in the next week, and then they're folded into a general flow of communication that goes out to everyone, regardless of what they've done or who they are. The person who visited and spent 3 hours with you, the person who bought a case on the way out because they couldn't help themselves, they're receiving the same content as someone who signed up on your website 3 years ago and has never bought a single thing. That's not a segmentation problem. That's a thinking problem. Now, here's what I find genuinely really puzzling about this, and I say this not to criticize, but because I think it points to something important. If you ask most winery owners what their most valuable marketing asset is, many of them will say the cellar door, the experience, the visit, and they're right. But if you look at where they invest in time, in money, in strategic thinking, the imbalance is quite obvious. The physical experience gets everything. It gets the renovation budget. It gets the interior design, the hospitality training, the wine education program for staff, the curated playlist, the carefully chosen glassware, years of accumulated thought about how to make those 2 or 3 hours the most memorable as possible. And the follow-up gets almost nothing. A thank you email maybe, a spot on the general mailing list, an assumption that if the visit was good enough, the relationship will take care of itself. I understand how this happens. The cellar door is tangible. You can see it, refine it, walk through it, and feel whether it's working. The digital follow-up is invisible, and for many winery owners, it feels like an afterthought. Something in the marketing department, if there is one, rather than an extension of the hospitality experience they've put their heart into. But here's the thing, those 2 hours you spend with someone at the cellar door, that experience you've refined over years, it has a half-life. The feeling it creates is real and powerful, but it fades. Not because people don't care, but because life continues. Memory is imperfect, and without something to extend that feeling and reconnect them to it, it quietly disappears. The most common thing I hear from wineries who have done the work to build proper digital follow-up for cellar door visitors in some version of, I had no idea how many people came back once we actually stayed in touch with them, not because those people had forgotten the winery, but because nobody had reminded them to return. The cellar door creates an opening. The question is whether you do anything with it. I want to focus on this specifically because I think it helps explain why so many wineries feel like their email marketing isn't working, when the real problem is much more particular than that. When someone visits your cellar door, they have an experience. It's sensory, it's personal, it's specific. They've tasted a particular wine that surprised them. They had a conversation with a staff member that just stuck with them. They stood somewhere, they felt something about the place that they can't quite articulate, but it was real. And then they receive a newsletter. The newsletter might be beautifully written. It might have lovely photography, warm copy, and genuinely interesting content about what's happening at the winery, but it wasn't written specifically for them. It was written for everyone, and they can feel that. The person who visited last weekend and absolutely raved about and loved your Shiraz doesn't necessarily want to hear about your rosé launch. They want someone to acknowledge what happened and to say essentially, we noticed you here, we thought about you, here's something that connects you back to the experience that you had with us. It's not really that complicated to do, but it does require knowing who this person is and what they did, which means that your email systems need to understand not just that someone is on the list, but how they came to be on the list and what their relationship with you actually looks like. Most wineries don't have this, and so the most powerful follow-up opportunity they have, the person who drove to them, tasted their wine, bought something, and left with a real feeling, gets treated identically to everyone else. People remember experiences at their emotional peak, and they remember how it ended. The cellar door is designed to be the peak. That's the whole point. But then the ending, when it's a generic newsletter, and over time, that just reshapes how the person thinks about the relationship and your brand. The visit was extraordinary, the follow-up was ordinary, and ordinary over time becomes forgettable. 981 people bought wine, 22 joined the wine club, and 22 cancelled. Net growth, 0. When I saw those numbers during a recent audit, I stopped, because on the surface, everything looked healthy. But when we looked closer, we found something most wineries never see. Customers were coming in, but they weren't progressing. First-time buyers weren't coming back. Cellar door visitors, they weren't being nurtured after they left. And new wine club members were cancelling at almost the exact same rate that they were joining. The problem wasn't more marketing. They needed to know where customers were getting stuck. That's why we created the Bean & Bitter DTC Growth Audit. We map your entire customer journey and identify the gaps stopping visitors from becoming long-term customers. And you'll walk away with a clear roadmap of what's working, what's missing, and where your biggest opportunities are hiding. Because the biggest opportunity usually isn't finding more customers, it's doing more with the ones that you already know. Head to www.beanum-vidder.com and click Growth Audit to apply. That's VINUM-VIDDER ta.com and click Growth Audit to apply. Now let's continue with this episode. Now, I think that the cellar door problem is actually a symptom of something more fundamental about how wineries think about their business. Most wineries were built around a physical model. Wine is made, wine is sold, and the relationship happens in person, at the winery, at the restaurant, at the bottle shop. The cellar door is a natural extension of that model. It's a place where the physical and the personal come together. However, DTC wine, direct-to-consumer wine, which is what most independent wineries are increasingly depending on for their survival and growth, it's a different model. It's a model that's built for ongoing relationships, on digital communication, on knowing your customers well enough to serve them over time without being in the same room. And here's the tension. Most wineries are trying to run a DTC model with a physical world mindset. The cellar door becomes a destination rather than the beginning. The visit becomes the relationship rather than the opening of one. And so when someone walks out, the assumption is that work is done. They came, they experienced, they bought, and now the ball is in their court. But in a DTC model, the work has barely just started. The visit is the moment when someone raises their hand and says, "I'm genuinely interested in you," and everything that follows, the emails, the content, the offers, invitations, is the response to that hand being raised. If you're not responding, it's not that the relationship failed. It's that the relationship never really began. The cellar door trap isn't about not having a follow-up system. It's about not having a follow-up philosophy, a belief that the visit creates an obligation, a real, meaningful obligation, to continue the conversation that started in the tasting room. The wineries that get this right don't think of digital follow-up as marketing. They think of it as a hospitality that extends beyond the property. The same care and attention that went into designing the tasting experience, that same intention goes into designing what happens next. And when someone receives that kind of follow-up, they notice, not because it's technically sophisticated, but because it feels like it was made for them by people who actually remember that they were there. So if you're a winery owner listening to this, here's the question I'd encourage you to sit with. For every person who visited your cellar door in the last 12 months, and depending on your winery, that might be hundreds or thousands of people, what happened next? Not in theory, but in practice. Did they receive something that acknowledged the specific experience that they had? Something that continued the conversation and started in your tasting room? Or did they receive what everybody else receives? And if you're honest about the answer, if the truth is that they largely went quiet, folded into a list somewhere, heard from you occasionally with content that wasn't written for them in mind, I'd ask you to sit with what that means. Not as criticism, but as a question about what you believe. Because if you believe the cellar door experience is your best thing your winery offers, if you believe that walking through the doors and tasting your wines with your team is something genuinely worth having, then the follow-up is an extension of that belief. The investment in the physical space says, this experience matters. What the follow-up says, or doesn't say, is whether you believe the relationship that experience creates matters equally. That's the real trap, not the absence of an email sequence. The absence of a belief of what happens after the visit is as important as the visit itself. Once you have that belief, the systems follow. The segmentation, the automation, the specific content for your cellar door visitors, those are implementation details. They're not hard. What's hard is deciding that this matters, that these people deserve a follow-up that's worthy of the experience that they had. Most wineries haven't made that decision yet. The ones that have, the ones where digital follow-up feels as intentional and as warm as the physical experience, they're the ones that are building something that lasts. One of the things that we look at in every Bean and Bitter growth audit is exactly this. What happens to your cellar door visitors after they leave? Not just whether you have a follow-up email, but whether the follow-up is worthy of the experience that preceded it, whether someone who visited last month would feel reading your emails like a person you remember or just a name on the list. If you would like to understand where your cellar door visitors are going after they leave and what it would take to bring more of them back and deeper, head to www.beanham-vidder.com and click Growth Audit to apply. I hope you guys gained some value from this episode, and I hope it made you think in a way that is relative to owning a DTC business over a physical business. And I'll catch you guys in the next episode. Thanks for joining us on this episode of the Beverage Business Hub podcast. To dive deeper and learn more from the experts in this episode, check out the show notes and hit subscribe so you never miss a beat keeping digital.